Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Navigating a Changing Reimbursement Landscape for Clinical Laboratories. Uh, we're really glad you could join us today. And before we get started, I just will say a few housekeeping things. We're going to be talking through some issues related to reimbursement for clinical laboratories. We have currently the video and microphones turned off for everybody. The chat feature is enabled, and we also have a Q&A feature. So if you have any questions regarding what we're talking about or things you'd like us to answer or address, feel free to shoot those into the Q&A sections or shoot me a chat directly. Really glad you could join us today. What we're going to do is talk about we're going to start by talking about the objective of the talk and then what the value is that we hope to bring to you as well. So first off, I'm Sean DiGiovanna. I am the head of research for Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting, and I want to introduce my colleague, John Warren. John, you want to say hello?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So hi, everybody. My name's John Warren. I'm the owner of Gettysburg Healthcare Consulting. We are a boutique consulting firm that helps labs just like your own navigate the Medicare coverage, coding, and reimbursement landscape. So really excited to be talking with you today about some of the changes in the landscape for clinical labs, and hopefully everybody gets something helpful out of this.
All right. And so we're going to start by focusing on some of these important changes, and we're going to leave the final part for some Q&A from whatever comes up. So John, you want to talk us through some of the key takeaways that we're going to cover today?
Sure. So let's just go through the agenda real quick. Well, we're going to talk about the key takeaways, then we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the Results Act and its impact on the clinical lab fee schedule. And then we'll bring that up to date by talking about the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2026, which just recently was signed into law by the president. And then we want to take some time toward the end of the presentation to talk about an issue that many labs are facing today with clawbacks for PCR testing. And then, of course, as Sean mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but anytime during the presentation, if anyone has any questions or any comments or suggestions, please drop them into the chat or into the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those toward the end of the call.
All right. And so, John, talk us through those key takeaways.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So the first thing that we're going to talk about and we'll spend a good bit of time talking about this is sort of developing a long-term sort of solution to the volatility that's been prevalent in the landscape, in the diagnostic landscape, really since the introduction of the payment cuts from the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. You know, the real question here isn't whether the lab fee schedule needs fixing. That debate has sort of run its course. It clearly needs to be fixed. The question now is whether Congress is willing to move away from its look at short-term fixes to a more long-term systemic solution. The other takeaway that we want to talk about, the other thing we'll be talking about a little bit today, is the volatility overall in the marketplace and how it's not just affecting reimbursement rates for lab services, but it's really having a material effect on the way labs perform their daily operations. And then last but not least, the final thing we'll talk about is how CMS has really quietly been expanding its efforts at data analytics and its audit activities, and how they've been focusing on areas where the agency believes that there may be fraud and abuse. And that, as I mentioned earlier, currently tends to be in the PCR-based lab testing area.
All right, that's a big agenda for today, but we'll get through it. So we're going to start with the Results Act. So John, what can you tell us? What is the Results Act?
Yeah, so hopefully everybody on the call has heard of the Results Act. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation that is really intended to fix the longstanding problems with how Medicare pays for lab tests under the clinical lab fee schedule. It got a lot of renewed attention toward the end of last year, quite simply because without the action that Congress took, Medicare would have seen, or would have made, I should say, additional cuts, maybe as high as 15%, that would have taken effect at the end of January. There was a hearing back in the beginning of January where multiple witnesses and multiple members fully acknowledged that the current system is not functioning the way that Congress intended. And that's really what the Results Act was meant to address as the primary legislative vehicle there.
And so what are they really trying to solve with this? What's going to be the mechanism for this?
Yeah, so Medicare rates are still being set using incomplete, outdated, unrepresentative data. So under the current PAMA framework, CMS is relying on private payer data that was collected all the way back in 2016, 10 years ago, from a very small percentage of laboratories, particularly in the hospital outreach area, as well as physician office labs. Those flawed data continue to drive the CLFS rates today. And as a result, what's happened because of the PAMA cuts is that Medicare has cut much deeper into the flesh of the reimbursement rates for these labs, sometimes as much as 4 times higher than what was originally projected. And this isn't really a theoretical issue anymore. It's really affecting the way routine testing is performed and is able to be accessed by Medicare beneficiaries every day.
And I imagine it's going to be very difficult for many of these labs to survive with these cuts.
Yeah, I mean, during that hearing, witnesses testified that there were over 800 lab tests that were facing additional reductions. And many of those are high volume routine blood tests or routine tests, excuse me, like a complete blood count, just something you get every time you go to the doctors. These are ordered on the daily. They're critical for monitoring chronic diseases. And they often represent a core menu for small and rural laboratories too, which are particularly hurt by these cuts. And the concern that was raised repeatedly over and over again during the hearing was that these common tests are being hit the hardest. And those are exactly what these smaller labs are relying on. And that's why this January 31st deadline kept coming up. It was really the moment when the cuts would have resumed, were it not for Congress's, again, temporary intervention.
Okay. Yeah, concerning. And so how would the Results Act really address these concerns?
Yeah, so this is where the Results Act really got practical. So instead of requiring individual labs to report thousands and thousands of private payer rates, CMS would have been required to contract with an independent, nonprofit third party who would run a claims database in order to obtain commercial payer data directly from health plans. This, in theory, would have captured hospital outreach labs. It would have captured physician office labs. It would have had real volumes, not just sort of estimates. And it would have actually reflected the commercial market. And during the hearing, Fair Health was cited as one example of the type of database that could meet these requirements. But in short, the idea is better data in, better rates out.
Okay, and so this would result in these changes would result in terms of having this data would help us do what?
Yeah, so really what it does is it focuses heavily on those widely available tests. It gets us a more accurate representation of what the commercial market space will really handle or will really tolerate in terms of reimbursement. And it really is aimed at stabilizing that part of the clinical lab fee schedule that drives the vast majority in terms of utilization of Medicare labs spending.
Gotcha. And I think we had another part of that slide there that we're going to show that, but there we go. So, all right. So, is this going to apply to all lab tests?
So no, and that's really important. And right now the way PAMA is set up, the PAMA data collection and data reporting process applies to all labs. Again, what would happen under results is CMS would use a more targeted approach to collecting data from this third-party database. So it's really not trying to reinvent everything. Again, it's just kind of trying to stabilize it.
Gotcha. And is this going to actually increase Medicare spending?
Not necessarily, and I think that came through pretty clearly in the hearing too. Lab testing overall represents less than 1% of total Medicare spending. Yet those results inform a significant portion of clinical decision making. So it's really an important part of the treatment paradigm. And the issue really is not necessarily one of overpayments. It's accuracy of the payments. And the Results Act is not meant to increase spending or to expand spending, but to correct a mechanism that is not aligned with what the commercial market actually pays. And I think that that alignment is really what one of the main reasons that the bill had attracted such bipartisan interest.
And so what's the current status of the bill?
So there's three things to watch. So right now the bill is, I'll say it's on hiatus, right? Is probably the best way to put it. So we saw the Consolidated Appropriations Act. We'll talk about that in a second and what that does. That doesn't necessarily mean that Results Act is dead, but I think what we'll see in the future is if it does move forward through the remainder of this Congress, it would be as a part of a larger Medicare bill. I don't see this particularly becoming a standalone sort of a bill. And of course, we're coming up with midterm elections. So, the bill would, I guess, technically, I don't know if expire is the right word, but it would have to be reintroduced in the next Congress in order to continue being able to move forward with it. Again, assuming nothing happens before the end of this Congress.
Understood. Okay. So if you were to kind of give a message that labs should take away from this, what would you say?
Well, I think there's really three key takeaways here. The first, this isn't a theoretical policy debate. We know that the consequences of the payment reductions from PAMA are visible. We know that they're measurable, and we know the impact that they have not only on labs, but on Medicare beneficiaries. So this isn't just, we think this is going to have a negative effect. We know that it will. The other thing to take away, and I think this is a real positive, is that Congress itself recognizes the problem, right? So they held the hearing on January 8th. There was broad agreement that the current system is broken, and the bipartisan support that the Results Act had really, again, underscores how important Congress thinks this issue is and how important it is to have some sort of fundamental structural change to the way these rates are set. And that Results Act, the third thing is really that Results Act is the leading structural fix, right? It's not perfect, but it does directly address a lot of the problems that's causing the instability and the reduction in payment rates. And for labs, this really means that engagement matters, particularly as lawmakers weigh whether to continue temporary fixes beyond this year or finally implement a durable solution.
Got it. And so we've talked now about what Congress might do. Let's talk about what Congress has done and talk about the Consolidated Appropriations Act. So what's in that for labs?
Yes, so there's a lot of things in the Consolidated Appropriations Act. It's a really huge bill. There's a fairly decent portion in there that is focused specifically on Medicare. There's a number of funding extenders for a couple of different programs, things like the Medicare Dependent Hospital Program, the quality measure endorsements. There's a handful of other low-income support programs. It continues to extend availability for a number of telehealth flexibilities that have been around, since the pandemic. And interestingly, for labs, it is going to require Medicare to provide coverage for multi-cancer early detection tests. Now, for that, the proof will be in the pudding, and we'll see how CMS ultimately implements that. But that is definitely a step forward. And to not leave out our friends in the pharma industry, there's a number of Part D reforms as well as changes to PBM transparency.
So there's a lot in there that we should be concerned about, but what's not in there?
Yeah. So that's really the key question. So the Results Act isn't in there, and this is a great bridge from what we were just talking about. Here's another situation where Congress has stepped in once again to delay the additional Medicare lab cuts. Those cuts are technically baked into statute, but every year for the past probably 8 to 10 years at least, Congress has stepped in and delayed additional cuts. The Results Act, as we talked about before, is really about a long-term fix to the system. It's about modernizing data collection. It's about correcting for sampling bias and improving transparency. The appropriations bill, by contrast, I think is Congress's way of saying, until we can figure out this real fix, we're not comfortable letting these cuts continue. So in many ways, I think the two efforts are complementary, right? The Results Act is that structural reform that is going to take time to implement, and it has to be done right. While these appropriations or these continual annual delays are doing short-term damage control.
Got it. And so at a high level, then what does this really mean for lab funding?
Yeah, so at that high level, like the guy on the screen is doing, Congress is basically kicking the can down the road for another year. It extends the phase-in of payment reductions for another year. So instead of happening this year or in 2028, they'll happen in 2029. And that's consistent with what we've seen every year since 2020, just another year farther down the road before those delays kick in. Congress had to do that. They had to step in to prevent those additional payment cuts. And that alone, I think, underscores a really important point that even Congress is recognizing that the current system is not functioning the way it was intended to.
And kicking the can down the road is a time-honored tradition in Congress for sure.
Indeed.
Um, so does that mean that labs are safe from cuts for now?
Well, I mean, safe is kind of a strong word, right? I mean, I think what this really does is delay the inevitable. So without a long-term fix, we are at some point going to see payment cuts. When and how much, we don't know. Will there be a long-term fix? I hope so, but again, we don't know. That PAMA methodology that is fully recognizable as being flawed is baked into the law. It is the law of the land. And technically, CMS is still required to base their payment rates for lab services on that data. And without some kind of statutory reform, I should say, those pressures don't go away. They're just deferred a little bit longer every year. And that's why we have this sort of odd pattern where Congress delays cuts year after year, but never fully replaces the methodology. From a lab perspective, right, that creates a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty really is what something like Results is trying to address.
And you had referenced this idea of data collection and reporting and changes to that. What's in the appropriations bill regarding that?
Yeah, so that's an important piece. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I have to wonder a little bit whether labs, particularly the smaller ones, are really ready for this. See, one of the things that the CAA does is it updates the data collection period, moving it forward to May through July of this year. In other words, labs are going to have to collect commercial payer data, and they'll have a 3-month period of May through July to collect that data from 2025. So they'll have that 3-month period to go back in time, look through their lab information systems, through their billing systems, whatever it happens to be, and gather that data. And why is that important? And why do I have sort of my own sort of wonders and concerns about that? One of the biggest criticisms of PAMA has always been that the data are stale, that the reporting population is skewed, and that the rates don't reflect today's market. So Congress has acknowledged that problem here through this appropriations bill by making a little tweak to the mechanisms of data reporting and saying, we want data from last year, not from 2016, 10 years ago, not from 2019, even 7 years ago. They want it from last year, from 2025. And again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is reinforcing a lot of the message behind what the Results Act was intended to do, and that's that better data is going to lead to better payment policy.
Right. And then so what are the three main takeaways for our labs from the CAA?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing to take away, Congress, I think, is still going to be actively engaged in lab payment policy. This isn't an area that they've completely walked away from. In fact, I think it's really the opposite. I think they are engaged in it. I think they do want to see change made. They just haven't been able to find the right vehicle, the right time to do that. Second, is the fact that I think payment relief keeps moving through these must payment bills. That tells us, or at least it tells me, that there is a level of bipartisan discomfort, if you will, with how PAMA is actually operating. And third, and this is really a strategic point, we've got to keep in mind this temporary relief is not a long-term sustainable business model. These appropriation delays, they help with cash flow in the short term, absolutely, but they're not giving labs that level of predictability, the level of confidence that they need to make long-term investments, or even a level of stability in pricing. And that's why these sorts of structural reforms, not just a delay in reporting or a delay in payment cuts, so on, but real true structural reform are so important. They're not about this year's cut. They're about whether the lab system is sustainable 5, 7, even 10 years from now.
Understood. All right. And so, one of the things that we've been working a lot on is the changes that have been or the proposed changes or imagined changes to policy regarding reimbursement for PCR testing in laboratories, especially for multiplex PCR. So what can we say about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, what we're seeing now is not a normal denial trend. I'm sure many of our listeners have seen some of these clawbacks. Maybe they've even gotten some of these clawbacks themselves. This isn't normal. This isn't just a documentation tweak. It's not a coding update. It's not something that a lab can operationally fix. What labs are being told across the country more and more increasingly every day by the contractors, by the Medicare contractors, and even some commercial payers is that 1 unit of PCR testing is payable per specimen, regardless of how many organisms are actually being tested. And that's a really big deal.
And when you say 1 unit per specimen, what does that really mean?
Yeah, in practice, it means that, a lab can test urine, wound, or maybe a respiratory specimen for multiple pathogens. Each of those pathogens may require its own primers, its own probes, its own validation, and it's going to result in a separate clinical answer or a separate clinical readout. What the contractors are saying is that we don't care about that. We'll pay 1 unit. We'll pay for 1 unit of testing. Everything else is denied because it all came from one sample. And and this seems to be even applying when testing's not performed on a closed cartridge or a panel. Even when the CPT descriptor literally says each organism. So the contractor is not necessarily questioning how the test was run or whether the test was run, there was a validation for the test that was run. They're saying that they disagree with how CPT is defining the codes for these tests in the first place.
Right. And so importantly, this is not a change in CMS policy.
No, and this is where it gets really uncomfortable. There have been no new CMS regulations, there's been no CPT revisions, no new NCDs, no manual updates, no correct coding edit updates. This has been strictly an interpretation by the Medicare contractors of what's on the books now. And, that's, I don't know, it's just really uncomfortable because, it looks to me like claims are not being processed consistently with what policy says. Policy in this case, it's not changing through rulemaking. The application of that policy is changing through audits.
Right. So this isn't really about labs keeping better documentation or better validation or better appeals, right?
No, I wish it was because that would make this, so much easier. And the fact that it doesn't is what makes this dangerous. This isn't a documentation problem. Labs are submitting their validation summaries. They're submitting their assay design documentations, their clinical rationales. They're still losing because the contractor's not debating any of those things. They're not debating how the test was performed or whether there's validation or whether documentation is there. They're debating whether multiple organisms should be payable from one specimen. At that point, there's no amount of documentation, I don't think, that's going to fix the problem. It's not a compliance issue. It's an interpretation of the policy.
And so why do you think we're seeing this escalate now? Why are they trying this now?
Yeah, there's a couple things I think that collided, and it's almost like a perfect storm. Post-COVID, molecular testing, particularly PCR testing, came under intense scrutiny. PCR became it became a highly visible spending category. At the same time, the NCCI panel at CMS declined to make any changes to their own policy, or to their own edits, I should say, over multiplex molecular testing. And, when there's silence at the national level like that, contractors come in, they fill the vacuum, not with rules, but with interpretations. And, when I heard about this, the first thing I thought of was, other issues or other areas in the past where CMS had a real concern about fraud and abuse. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, CMS has been consistently building up their data analytics capability. What I suspect they saw is an increase in spending on PCR type testing. And anytime CMS sees a significant increase in spending for any kind of service, whether it's a lab test or a hospital service or whatever, their almost gut reaction is to think fraud and abuse, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what these contractors are thinking, is that there's the real potential for fraud and abuse, or at least a risk to the program, so they feel that they have the obligation to stop that.
Yeah. And so obviously individual labs will appeal these decisions, but that's not going to be enough in the end to really change the policy.
Yeah, and we would encourage labs, I would encourage labs certainly to, continue to appeal these denials. That is the lab's right. They absolutely should take advantage of that, shouldn't, ignore that at all. But it's not really until you get to the very end of the appeals process that any of those individual decisions have any impact on policy. It's not until you get to the ALJ level that, a particular finding may be applicable to other claims. So you have a situation throughout the appeals process where one lab might win, another one might lose, another one may face some kind of extrapolation. None of these outcomes are doing anything to protect the broader market. It's really addressing your own individual lab issue, which is amazingly important, and I can't underscore how important that is. But we can't appeal our way into national clarity.
Yeah. And so clearly this is going to have, financial impact on labs themselves. But beyond that, what are some of the other risks of this policy?
Yeah, it's not just reimbursement, it's not just payment rates, it's not just, revenue for labs. Look, at the end of the day, it's access. If payment is limited to one organism per specimen, multiplex testing, particularly with PCR, becomes economically infeasible, some would argue even impossible. Lab menus are going to shrink. Beneficiaries are going to lose access to this kind of testing, or they're going to have to travel farther to get testing. Clinicians are going to lose all of the actionable information that they get from these kinds of tests. That's not, in my mind, cost control. That's regression in patient care.
Yeah. And so what's going to change this dynamic?
So I think what has the best possibility of changing the dynamic is to be able to shift the discussion from individual billing disputes into like a category level policy discussion. And that's going to require sharing data, sharing information. It's going to require consistent messaging, and it's going to require a unified record from the lab industry. Because CMS responds differently, I think, when an entire category is affected and not just a single lab.
Right. And so what can we do? What can labs do?
Well, so for labs that do PCR testing, like we're talking about, this really clearly it affects you if it hasn't already. It is very likely to in the near future. And once this interpretation becomes normalized, I'm concerned that it's going to spread. So we're putting together a coalition of lab companies, not to necessarily relitigate the past or go through the appeal process. That's a lab specific kind of thing, but really to protect future access to PCR testing. And that requires us to stand together before the next denial arrives.
Right. And so what would you say are the key takeaways for labs to strategize coming out of this?
Yeah, I mean, the instinct is going to be, I think for most labs to ask, well, what do we do? The honest answer in many cases is At the lab level, there's, deal with your appeals. That's again, broken record, but that's very important. Beyond that, as an individual lab, this is a situation where the rules are being reinterpreted in real time. And when that happens, the solution to that can't be an operational change. It can't be changing your standard operating procedures. It can't be redoing your intake forms. It has to be a structural change. And that's why we're putting together this national coalition. And to be clear, what this is, it's not going to be a trade association. It's not going to be a lobbying association. And it's not going to argue that labs should get paid more. That's not the point of this coalition. The point is really focused, and that is to protect continued access to clinically appropriate PCR testing, particularly multiplex PCR. And we're going to do that by addressing some of the policy ambiguities that are existing before they harden into more permanent contractor behavior. In practical terms, what that means is looking for and identifying patterns across MACs, across commercial plans, evaluating the impact of these policy interpretations on the industry, and presenting CMS with a unified evidence-based record showing the real risk and the real impact on access. This is really about policy clarity. And, like I mentioned before, CMS responds very differently when it's a single lab. It doesn't even have to be a lab. When it's a single company raising concerns, than they do when it's an entire category presenting the same concerns. One lab, maybe it looks like an individual dispute. But if you have 5, 10, 15, 20 labs together, then CMS is going to start to think, well, this is really a systemic problem. And those are the kind of problems that get attention.
Right.
And really, this doesn't require any lab to necessarily be under audit today. In fact, a lot of the labs that matter the most or would have the most to gain out of this would be some of those ones that haven't even been hit yet. Because once the denial arrives, leverage is reduced, right? The goal here is to prevent these audits, these clawbacks from happening in the future. So, I would encourage that any lab that does PCR testing, whether it's UTI, whether it's wound, respiratory, whatever, especially those that rely on multiplex methodologies, this coalition is relevant. And it's not because you've done anything wrong. In fact, most of you, I would venture to guess, the vast majority of you are doing everything right. But silence is being interpreted as agreement by CMS. And that's how these things kind of become sort of codified over the world, throughout the market. So, Sean, I think over the next couple of days, we'll be circulating a brief interest form, not a commitment in any way, but just a way to see if there's any labs that are interested in being a part of this coordinated national response. We'll outline some of the things about how the coalition will work, how we'll protect confidentiality, how the coalition plans to engage in CMS and so on, and we welcome everyone's voice in that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out that this is the issue which has come to the fore, but there are potentially other issues facing PCR labs that also, if they can interpret this one in a certain way, they can certainly interpret other policies in a different way. So this is important I think for everyone to kind of get together on. As you said, CMS pays more attention when people are speaking with one voice. So we'll make sure to get that link out to people. And as I should have said at the beginning, we're going to provide a copy of the transcript and the video of this webinar, as well as contact information so you can get in touch with us if you need. And so now that we've kind of reached the end of what we wanted to necessarily talk about, we're open for some questions. If anyone has some questions, we definitely had a comment from Angelica saying, no support for appeals. So I think that's one thing that labs are concerned about is, the appeals process and whether it is actually effective or not. And especially it's difficult, I think, for a lot of small labs to do that process.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I'll be perfectly honest, Angelica, appeals is not our swim lane. We do have colleagues that we work with, though, some of whom may be on the call this afternoon, but we can certainly put you in contact with some of those folks that are very well versed in the appeals process. It can be a very complex process. I know that. and it's something that you want to make sure that you get right. So you definitely want to work with somebody who is well versed, and certainly happy to make those connections with folks that we know, that Sean and I know, and that we work with, that do appeals on the regular basis.
All right. And if there are any other questions, I'll give us a few more seconds for people to put something in the chat if they're interested in hearing anything else. But I want to also just thank John for his insights and for his time. And this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. As I said, we're going to provide you with information, both of all the stuff we've covered today, as well as an invite into the coalition talks. We also are planning some future webinars. So there's a link that you can subscribe to just get an email notification when those go up. And again, our goal is maybe every 6 weeks or so to put something together. So we're not gonna be hitting you up a lot with stuff. But please, of course, reach out to us if you have questions or need any other information. And as I said, you'll be getting an email shortly after we conclude, which will have a link to the video of the webinar and also the transcript. So if there's nothing else from people, and doesn't look like there is, I think we've done our job, John.
All right. Thanks, Sean.
I want to thank everyone for coming out, and thanks again, especially to John. I know you guys got some busy time, so we'll let you out of school a little bit early, and look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. Take care, everybody.
Take care, all.